Welcome to the West Virginia Archives and History Library for our Tuesday evening lecture. Upcoming lectures, we have African American Life in Charleston, A Personal Perspective by Barbara Hicks Lacey. That's part of our block speaker series. That's August 28th at 6 o'clock right here in the library. Then on September 2nd, Brian Kesterson will be, his lecture topic is Incidents of Morgan's Raid with an account of Stovepipe Johnson's retreat through West Virginia. So that's a book they wrote here recently. Tonight, Dr. Kevin Barksdale will present From Lost State to Mountain State, the State of Franklin and the Constitutionality of West Virginia Statehood. In 1874, the political leaders of what would become Eastern Tennessee, then part of the state of North Carolina, initiated an effort to create America's 14th state. Naming their new state after venerable statesman Benjamin Franklin, the leaders of Franklin engaged in a 4-year struggle to gain admission into the Union while battling the region's Native American communities and the determined internal opposition to the party. Over Franklin's tumultuous 4-year existence, the leadership managed to erect a state government, judicial system, and militia. The Franklinites also drafted a new state constitution and launched a determined campaign to win public and political support for their state. Despite their efforts, the state of Franklin ultimately collapsed in early 1788, but not before leaving behind a constitutional legacy that would play a central role in the creation of the state of West Virginia in 1863. Dr. Barksdale will explore the history of the state of Franklin and its impact on the drafting of the United States Constitution and the creation of the mountain state nearly 80 years later. Dr. Barksdale is an associate professor of history at Marshall University, where he teaches courses on West Virginia, Appalachian, and 18th century American history. He has published a book on the state of Franklin entitled The Lost State of Franklin, America's First Secession in 2008. He is currently working on a project that explores the history of the decade following the American Revolution in the lower Mississippi Valley. Dr. Barksdale also serves on the West Virginia Humanities Council and West Virginia Civil War Sesquicentennial Commission. Please welcome Dr. Barksdale.
Make sure I get this microphone right. I'm naturally loud voiced. I don't want to make anybody deaf. All right. What to do when a historian has too much technology? Welcome. Thank you, guys. I wanted to thank Joe Geiger and the staff of the West Virginia Division of Culture and History and the West Virginia State Archives for inviting me, and for all of you for attending on this humid but nice evening. I'm originally a South Carolinian, but I received my PhD from WVU, where I work with Ron Lewis, who I think is one of the state's greatest historians. And it was at WVU, I finished in 2005, that the intersection of West Virginia history and my interest in the state of Franklin met. And that's sort of what I've never had an opportunity to give this talk. My students hear it every semester. I teach West Virginia history every semester at Marshall. But I've never had an opportunity to try to make this direct connection. So that's what I want to do. I want to take this State of Franklin statehood movement, which is unquestionably a fairly obscure historical event. I don't know how many of you have even heard of it. I personally have gotten a tremendous amount of professional mileage out of a historical moment that lasted a little over 3 years in the middle of nowhere, which very few people have heard of outside of East Tennessee. But this talk, as the gentleman that introduced me mentioned, is really going to be in 2 parts. The first, I'm going to give you a kind of a bare bones history of Franklin. I think it's a really interesting statehood movement. It has a lot of connections to Kentucky's statehood movement, Tennessee's later, and also West Virginia's statehood movement, approximately 80 years later. In the second part of my lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about how Franklin impacted the drafting of the United States Constitution, and specifically a provision that's added into that Constitution that has a direct impact on how the sort of founding fathers of West Virginia and Abraham Lincoln's administration shaped how West Virginia became a state. So there's a a strong connection between the state of Franklin and West Virginia that I'm going to try to make. So, in short, I guess my thesis would be, in short, the state of Franklin and its collapse had a direct impact on the process in which West Virginia became a state and the constitutional considerations of the founding fathers of West Virginia and the Lincoln administration. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the state of Franklin. In 1784, the political and economic leaders, almost always the same people, of the Upper Tennessee Valley declared their communities independent from their parent state of North Carolina and named their community, eventually decided to name this collection of communities the state of Franklin. This is a kind of an early map of Tennessee, one of my favorite maps. When you're talking about where Franklin was, if you're familiar with East Tennessee, Johnson City, Kingsport, Bristol, that area, if you've been to Johnson City, one of the main thoroughfares is the state of Franklin Boulevard. So that's the area I'm talking about. After declaring their independence in 1784, over 3 years, the Franklinites constructed a state bureaucracy, a legal system, a judicial system, a legislature, a militia, had currency, none of it exists, I don't know what it looked like, a state seal, a state flag, those don't exist either. No, all the trappings of a state, they managed to put them together. They also launched a massive diplomatic and public relations campaign to convince Americans to support Franklin's admission into the Union as the 14th state. And lastly, they also sort of extend this lobbying effort into the United States Congress and even beyond, reaching out to the most prominent Americans of the day. It's not a coincidence they named it their state Franklin after Benjamin Franklin. It was a way to attract the support of someone who was well respected and who could probably throw their influence behind Franklin's effort of admission into the Union. Ultimately, the state effort collapses. Obviously, there's no state of Franklin, and it collapses for two basic reasons. External opposition from North Carolina, and I'll talk about that, and internal opposition. There were a lot of people in what was Franklin that didn't want this state to exist. Again, there are a lot of similarities between what happens with Franklin and what happens with West Virginia. We have the same sort of dynamics. I'll maybe flesh those out a little bit more in a minute. So the first question is, why in the world would a relatively small group of sort of influential political and economic elite in East Tennessee decide to, there is no Tennessee, by the way, that hasn't happened until 1796. Why would they declare themselves independent from North Carolina and to embark on this dangerous, uncertain separatist movement? What inspired them? What inspired men like William Cock, who would be the sort of, I would say, the sort of political mastermind behind this? He was the key diplomat. I'll talk more about him. And the governor, John Sevier, Franklin's only governor, John Sevier, he's the Frank Pierpont of Tennessee. He's the first governor, the central figure in early Tennessee history. Well, why would these men risk arrest? Sevier will be arrested. Why would they risk losing their financial stake in the region, largely land holdings? Why would they risk it? What was in it for them? Why would they embark upon this dangerous path? And before we can really answer that question, I have to talk a little bit, really kind of challenge a lot of popular perceptions of what the early American frontier looked like. You have images of what the frontier looked like: marauding, savage Indians, and isolation and backwardness, and being separated from the civilized East, and those sorts of things. And in truth, by the end of the American Revolution, a lot of the Trans-Appalachian West, this sort of larger region, had already begun to develop a strong political economy. In essence, capitalism was flourishing in 1784 in Tennessee, and the financial stake that a lot of these political leaders like Cock and Sevier and Landon Carter, and it's a sort of a who's who of Tennessee history who was involved in this, that they had such financial stake in it that the sort of development of this early market economy in the Upper Tennessee Valley is going to have a major impact on driving this statehood movement. From the beginning of the settlement of the Tennessee Valley, capitalism and the market economy played a critical role in shaping the region's social, economic, and political maturation. The earliest residents The sort of first Tennessean is a man by the name of William Bean. It's like saying Morgan is the first West Virginian. That's probably not true, but William Bean is going to get that. He was a good friend of Daniel Boone. He gets that sort of moniker. Men like William Bean, John Carter, Evan Shelby, Jacob Brown. Again, these are prominent names in Tennessee, Kentucky history. They were entrepreneurs. They were capitalists. They didn't move onto the frontier for the adventure. They moved onto the frontier to make money, to expand their political and economic, to improve their political and economic fortunes. These men utilized the rapidly developing regional economy to build successful businesses, a wide range of businesses, hotels, stores, taverns, of course we're talking Tennessee, distilleries. They also engaged in commercial agriculture, slaveholding, and the slave trade, and most importantly, I just spent 30 minutes talking about this, land speculation. Land speculation on the early American frontier was probably the quickest and most often utilized way for individuals and families to accumulate wealth. There's a massive shortage of hard currency and specie in the West, and land becomes how people become wealthy. It's a very sort of, and this applies not only here in what becomes Tennessee, but Kentucky, West Virginia. The accumulation of large amounts of land and selling that land off for a profit becomes a way of making tremendous amounts of money. You can't understand early America if you don't understand the role land speculation played. Land speculation and its related occupations, surveying, those sorts of things, it drives the legal profession in the West. As I said, the fastest means of accumulating wealth and political power and influence. It's not a coincidence that the leaders of Franklin and the opponents of Franklin all were the largest landholders in the area. They had the most at stake. I'm sure most of you know this, many of America's great families built their fortunes on land speculation. The Washingtons, the Lees, the Byrds, the Seviers, the Cox, the Carters, the Lewises in Tennessee, William Blount, maybe the most corrupt 18th century political figure out there. The Robertsons, they all amassed large fortunes buying land, and we could debate if they actually bought it, but acquiring land and then turning around and selling that land off. I won't go into great detail about land speculation, but a little primer on land speculation. Essentially how it works at the end of the 18th century is wealthy individuals and land companies with investors dispatched individuals, many of these people you're going to know, like Daniel Boone, William Bean, George Washington, Andrew Lewis, Thomas Jefferson's father, Peter Jefferson, Joshua Fry, a huge list of sort of who's who of early American sort of influentials, dispatched these individuals out to locate valuable land. After the land was located, then the acquisition of that land was the next step. It was done in a number of different ways. Mostly in the area that I'm talking about, it was either purchased from colonial governments, and that's a kind of a complicated process, purchased from French and Indian War or soldiers of the American Revolution. They were given grants for pay, or bought sometimes at the point of a gun from the region's Native Americans. Probably the best example of of land speculation in this region, and maybe in early America, was Richard Henderson's Transylvania Purchase, which happened to be in the general area that I'm talking about. Henderson was a judge, deeply connected, used his connections to accumulate some investors in this Transylvania company. They end up meeting at a place called Sycamore Shoals, which is outside of Elizabethton, Tennessee. It's a beautiful historic site now. And they basically bought 20 million acres of land from the Cherokee for a song. The Henderson Purchase, you end up with a half a dozen individuals owning 20 million acres. The next step in that was, of course, they don't want 20 million acres. Most of them don't want to live out there anyway. The next step is obviously to survey it. If you've ever poked into the early history of Virginia or West Virginia surveying, you know how primitive it was. Here's a surveying compass from an individual by the name of William Calk, who was a Kentuckian. I couldn't find it. It's difficult to find this kind of thing, but These surveys were undertaken. A number of the surveyors became fabulously wealthy because what better way to spot valuable land than to go out surveying? You see this a lot. George Washington at 17, Daniel Boone. The list pretty much it goes on and on and on. And then you would survey this land out. The survey, if you read the early land grants and surveys, they surveyed off of rocks in the rivers and trees, and it was a very imprecise process. And then after you had some sense of, these are all from Kentucky, by the way, early sense of where your land was, then you had to register it, and that was done typically at the courthouse. And out on the frontier, one of the big pushes will be to build courthouses. And they don't want courthouses because they want to sue each other, or they're worried about law and order. They want courthouses so they can register land grants. That's what most of these courts do. And if you've ever read any early 18th century sort of Kentucky, Tennessee legal documents, you'll find 95% of them had to deal with the purchasing or sale of land or disputes over land and that sort of thing. So that's sort of how it plays out. Find the land, survey the land, register the land, and then rinse and repeat, if you will. So you have the development of early market capitalism, you have this influence of land speculation, all having a major influence on the sort of pre-State of Franklin period in this area. Another aspect of this that has to be talked about is just how violent this area was. You really can't minimize how remarkably violent the American frontier was. You read any 18th century stuff about what becomes West Virginia. I mean, there are 800-page volumes of nothing but Indian raids and massacres, and it was a particularly violent period. The Upper Tennessee Valley was also remarkably violent. The violence and the perceived threat of violence influenced the political and social dynamics and the decision-making within the region. You know, growth of capitalism and the desire to dominate that economy, the growing competition over land and land speculation, and then violence, all are going to be these factors that are going to drive the Franklin statehood movement, and I'll make that connection in a minute. The residents of the Tennessee Valley found themselves in constant peril from the region's Indians. Specifically, when you're talking about the region's Indians, you're talking about the Overhill Cherokee. There are three big clusters of Cherokee in the 18th century: the Lower Cherokee in South Carolina, the Valley Cherokee, who are basically in North Carolina, where the Colonel Lefty Reservation, that stuff is now, and even beyond. And then the Overhill Cherokee, because they were over the hill, and the Overhill Cherokee will be the Cherokee that will clash with the Franklinites. You also have the Upper Creeks, who are largely in Alabama, but who have a strong stake in a lot of the Tennessee Valley. They'll also be involved in this. The vast majority of Indian violence, Indian and white violence, has to do with white encroachment, meaning white families, or communities, or land surveyors. You didn't want to get caught. If you got caught on the frontier with one of those compasses, you were as good as dead in the 18th century in the Upper Tennessee Valley. But these clashes between Indians and whites it's about land, and about whites moving onto their land, their hunting ground, taking their land, asserting their land, negotiating deals, backroom deals with Indian chiefs who didn't have the authority to make these deals. That created a tremendous amount of anger among the native peoples. You also have the British, and of course the American Revolution didn't end the British threat. You still have British firmly ensconced in Canada, also in East Florida, also in the Caribbean, who are funding these Native American groups. You also have the Spanish down in Louisiana and West Florida, who are funding the Creeks. So you have weapons and logistical support pouring into these Indian communities, and they are turning against groups like the Franklinites and the Kentuckians and the Western Virginians who are trying to take their land. As 1783 and 1784 sort of become particularly violent periods in this story, people living in the West begin to demand that their state governments, in this case North Carolina, do something about this Indian violence. What they want money to expand militias, frontier militias. They want money to build forts. They want money to pay off Indians. They want, they want money to essentially decimate Indians, take Indian land. After the American Revolution, North Carolina is not particularly interested in that. North Carolina, as well as the national government, are particularly, they're bankrupt. The American Revolution bankrupted the national government, or what was left of the national government, and the state governments as well. They had huge debt. They can't afford Indian wars, so most of the states, the southern states, begin to look for other ways of acquiring Indian land and accomplishing their goals. And they do this through treaties. Probably the most important one for this story is the Treaty of Hopewell, negotiated in South Carolina with the Cherokee and the Chickasaw and the Choctaw and a handful of other groups. And essentially in between North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Essentially, this is the kind of thing that the United States government and the states wanted to do. Let's meet, let's ask them what they want, let's give it to them and then take their land, and then we can acquire their land that way. It's a lot cheaper than to go to war with them. In the state of Franklin, Kentucky, these other places, they don't want these sort of specific policies. They want war and money for war, and they're dealing with it in a much more sort of in-your-face way. The Franklinites are going to believe, one of the major motives for the state of Franklin is they believe that they can, once they're free from North Carolina, they can conduct their own Indian policy, their own Indian diplomacy, or lack of diplomacy, and they can make their own treaties. That's what they want. Lastly, when we're talking about violence, one of the things that you don't get a lot of in East Tennessee or in West Virginia as well are large-scale pitched battles associated with the American Revolution. But that doesn't mean that the American Revolution and its legacy didn't play a major role in the state of Franklin, especially the sort of principles and ideas of the Revolution. Things about self-determination and a responsible state, responsible governments, and those sorts of things, the rights to pursue your own sort of happiness and those sorts of things. Those are going to be very powerful ideas for these Franklinites. Most of the leaders of the state of Franklin participated in a number of battles during the Revolution, mostly in the sort of southern theater after 1780. A number of them, just another sort of peripheral West Virginia connection, a number of them were at Point Pleasant, at the Battle of Point Pleasant against Cornstalk and the Shawnee as well. That's just sort of a side note. I'm not asserting that the Battle of Point Pleasant was part of the American Revolution. I'm not going to go down that road. But these sort of leaders of Franklin and the opponents of Franklin really sort of rely upon their experience during the Revolution and what that meant to them and what they did to support either, they sort of wrap their arguments for or against Franklin in this sort of history and the legacy of this. Probably in East Tennessee, the most important event during the American Revolution, as far as military event, was the Battle of Kings Mountain. I'm not going to go into great detail, but October 1780, the militias of the upper East Tennessee Valley joined with the militias of North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia, parts of them, traveled from that part of East Tennessee, met at Sycamore Shoals. This is where Richard Henderson negotiated with the Cherokee for his 20 million acres. Traveled to what is 30 miles south of Charlotte. If you've ever driven down 77 on your way to Myrtle, you see 2 or 3 little mountains. One's Crowder's, one's King's, and another one I don't know if it has a name. But it would be at that little mountain that these East Tennesseans would confront a British force largely made up of Americans anyway. This will be loyalists versus patriots or supporters of the American cause. And they'd clash on October 8, 1780, and give them the moniker the Over Mountain Men because they traveled over the mountain. Many of the leaders of Franklin, as a matter of fact, just about all the leaders of Franklin and all the opponents of Franklin served at the Battle of Kings Mountain or had family that did as well. The Battle of Kings Mountain was a resounding success. It's probably the reason why it becomes such an important symbol in East Tennessee. American troops succeeded in capturing 716, killing 225 British loyalists, including Patrick Ferguson, the commander of British troops, who's buried up on Kings Mountain now. But Kings Mountain and the legacy of that battle, while it's just a blip on the radar of the American, or the sort of larger conflict surrounding the Revolution, it had a major impact on how people thought in East Tennessee. It created and elevated military leaders into positions of political, economic power. John Sevier was a military leader who parlayed that into political office. Members of the Sevier, the Tipton families, I'll talk about this as well as other major figures in the Franklin movement were at Kings Mountain. It created strong community cohesion. People were and are proud of the Battle of Kings Mountain and the role that East Tennesseans and the legacy that battle had in that community. And lastly, it created the revolution itself and the Battle of Kings Mountain connected to it, created the rhetoric, the language, the symbolism that will, and the mythology, if we're being honest, that will be used by the Franklinites to sort of justify the movement. So the convergence of market economy, land speculation, Indian violence, and the legacy of the American Revolution come together to really create this force that will propel the state of Franklin movement forward. So when does it begin? Well, the state of Franklin movement officially begins with the 1784 Cession Act, the cession of land. Essentially, it's a pretty easy story. What happens is after the American Revolution, as I said, the federal government, the national government is broke, the state governments are broke, and many of the southern states have a considerable amount of western land that is either largely uninhabited by whites, and it's states like Virginia, New York, Georgia have a lot of western land. And as the federal government begins to look for ways of sort of crawling out of the debt caused by the Revolution, they begin to look at that western land, especially Virginia's western land, if we're honest, and they begin to think, well, that land could be used to raise money for debt relief. We could either, we could tax it. We could tax Virginia, tax North Carolina, tax Georgia for their western land. Or we could offer to, if they will cede that land to us, we'll overlook the tax bill, and we can take that land, break it up, sell it for a profit, and get out of debt. And between 1780 and 1784, several states cede land. Virginia and New York specifically cede most of their western land. By 1784, North Carolina, who was in a particularly bad financial crisis at this time, finally decides we'll entertain that. In the North Carolina General Assembly in the spring of 1784, they come together, they debate, are we going to give our western land to the federal government? Essentially the federal government says, look, the states actually owed the national government money. They borrowed money from the national government. States borrowed money from foreign investors. They borrowed money from local individuals. The American Revolution was fought on the credit card, if you want to be honest. And North Carolina decides, we are going to debate it. We're going to debate ceding this land or not. During the debate over this, there's largely strong support to cede this land, but during the debate you have a lot of people who will eventually play leadership roles in Franklin who are promoting ceding this land. They're actually saying, well, we need to do this, this is what we need to take care of. They're doing this in a kind of a sinister way, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Eventually, North Carolina passes the Cession Act in 1784, and the federal government has given North Carolina's western land, which would be Tennessee, if we're talking about it in today's terms. 4 months after North Carolina cedes that land, the political and economic leaders of East Tennessee travel to the little town of Jonesboro. They call it Tennessee's first town. It's a beautiful little town if you've never been there. They meet at the Washington County's law courthouse in Jonesboro, and they come together and they decide to declare themselves independent. At the time, there are 3 counties, Washington, Sullivan, and Greene, from North Carolina, and they declare their intention to become a state, making them the 14th state. They gave a lot of reasons why they wanted to do this. Some of them are legitimate, some of them are just done for show. One of the strongest arguments they make is they say North Carolina has abandoned us. They have ceded us to the federal government. They've abandoned us to the red savages. And in reality, what had happened is a number of the political leaders in the state legislature from this part of North Carolina had whipped up a groundswell for the Secession Act in 1784, and then turn around and say, that's why we are declaring ourselves independent. Well, many of these people were land speculators. It was a pretty sinister kind of way of doing it. They make a number of other claims. In Western Virginia makes a lot of these same claims to Virginia throughout the 19th century about why West Virginia should be a state. Things like the Eastern government's not responsive. We're not getting money for internal improvements. We're not getting money for frontier defenses. The state political power rests so far from us that it's hard for us to have a stake in our sort of direction of our state. So they declare themselves. They don't have a name yet, but they're going to be independent. They're going to break from North Carolina. They want to be the 14th state. As soon as the political leadership back in the East, at the time the capital of North Carolina is in Hillsborough, hears this, and they learn. Well, they basically figure out they've been duped. They immediately, in October, repeal the Secession Act and reclaim their western land. Eventually goes to the United States Supreme Court, where the United States they uphold the Secession Act. This actually happens later. But essentially, North Carolina said, we're not going to be duped by these future Franklinites. We want our land back. But the cat's out of the bag. In December of 1784, October, North Carolina repealed the Secession Act. In December, the political leaders of the Tennessee Valley again come back to Jonesboro, reaffirm their support for a new state, and that's when the fun starts. It'll be in 1785 when the leaders of Franklin sort of begin the process of creating the state. And it's pretty difficult to talk about, it's pretty difficult to sort of dig under the whole state-making process in Franklin, because so many of the records were destroyed during this period of time. And I'll talk about how they were destroyed. That's a really interesting story as well. But I want to briefly focus on three aspects of the creation of the Franklin government in 1785 to give you a sense of what this looked like. First, the construction of the Franklin legislature and judicial system, the debate over the Franklin Constitution, and lastly, the public relations campaign started by the Franklinites to try to convince Congress and prominent Americans to support their admission into the Union. So, despite the repeal of the Secession Act at the end of 1784 and opposition from North Carolina, the political and economic leaders of Franklin rapidly began to assemble the state's legislature and judicial system, filling key posts in the Franklin government. These posts would be comprised of the region's most influential political, economic, and military leaders. I mentioned some of these. John Sevier, the first and only governor of Franklin, descendant of French Huguenots. They called him Nola Chucky Jack. He was a military war hero, and people loved him. People still love him. I've been scolded many times at these talks in Tennessee by saying disparaging things about John Sevier. Not personal attacks, just uncomfortable historical facts. I mentioned William Cobb, Franklin's diplomat. David Campbell, the Virginia Campbell family, a very prominent, he's the Chief Justice of the Franklin Supreme Court. It's lasted less than a year, but still probably the most important legal mind. Landon Carter from the Carter family, Virginia Carter family. And these are prominent, powerful figures. After they put together their sort of state government, they begin the process of actually organizing the state. The first thing they do is they set up courts. Again, they're not setting up courts because they're worried about slander cases or murder cases. Those are few and far between. They're setting up courts to deal with land. That's what it's all about. They appoint and elect law enforcement officials. You get a tremendous amount of law enforcement, largely to lead militias and to protect communities, keep the peace. They did organize a Franklin militia as well as individual county militias. They passed a considerable amount of legislation early on, almost all of it dealing with land and improving the regional economy. And lastly, they created Franklin's counties, naming many of them after themselves. Who would have thought? Most of these counties don't exist in Tennessee, and North Carolina never recognized them. So once you have the outline of the Franklin government created, next is coming together and creating a frame of government, a constitution. The battle over the Franklin Constitution and I talk about this specifically to demonstrate to my students that we have this notion that the American Revolution and that the sort of founding fathers of America were these sort of strong supporters of democracy and political participation and egalitarian governments and these sorts of things. And there were some, but there were many more who thought only certain kinds of people should vote. I talk to my students all the time. Are you Protestant? If you're not, many of them didn't want you to vote, especially if you're a Catholic or you're a woman. Need not apply. Black, Indian, didn't own land. The list goes on and on of who couldn't vote, who serve in political office. When they're beginning to draft the Franklin Constitution, it's actually the Presbyterian leadership in the region. The Presbyterian Church was early Baptist and Presbyterians were the dominant denominations in this area. It'll be the Presbyterian church leaders who play a big role in this constitutional debate. And essentially what you end up with is a debate between two constitutions. One drafted by William Graham, who was a minister and was head of Liberty Hall, which, as you can see, became Washington and Lee, and the Reverend Sam Houston, who was let me make sure I get this right, the uncle of the Sam Houston of Alamo fame, on one side, and on the other side you end up with another Presbyterian minister, Hezekiah Balch, and his supporters. The so-called Houston Graham Constitution, the exact title is Declaration of Rights, a constitution made by the representatives of the freemen of Franklin. You notice they didn't spell it like Benjamin Franklin. That was a nod to the concept of freemen, but that doesn't last long. This Constitution is maybe the most remarkable 19th century Constitution. It's very strange, and there's interesting things like, and it's hard to wrap your mind around this, but this Constitution prohibited lawyers, ministers, distillery owners from holding political office. Pretty interesting. But what this Constitution really did is it expanded the electorate. There was nothing about having own property to vote or hold political office. It basically was a fairly egalitarian document that expanded democracy on the frontier. On the other side, you have Balch's proposal. He's a strong opponent of the Houston Graham Constitution, and Balch and his supporters basically want to maintain the status quo. They only want a certain kind of person, certain kind of people to hold political office, certain kind of people to vote, to have political influence, and you get a clash. And what ends up happening in this constitutional convention held at the Greenville Presbyterian Church is that the Houston Graham Constitution is basically defeated overwhelmingly, because the last thing the leaders of the state of Franklin wanted is to diffuse their political power. They don't want that. They don't want more people to have a voice in the government. They want to control what happens with Franklin. They want to control their political destiny. And eventually what you end up with is a constitution that basically looks exactly like the North Carolina Constitution that they brought with them, with a few modifications. Things about slavery, things about Indians, a few tweaks in there. But this was a great opportunity to create a constitution that we would hold up. Now, if it would have passed, we would have held up as a sort of an example of frontier democracy flourishing, which is not really what happened. And the third thing I mentioned, government, the Constitution. The last thing is the diplomatic effort. The Franklinites knew from the beginning it wasn't going to be easy to get their state into the Union. And the first thing they decided to do is to name their state after Ben Franklin. That's a tremendous PR coup. We're going to name it after Ben Franklin. They sent him a letter. We've named this state after you. We'd love your support. He says no, but they were thinking about how are they going to do this. The individual they put in charge of trying to convince Congress to accept Franklin into the Union is William Cock. Cock was known as a brilliant orator. He's referred to numerous times as a gifted speaker. And Cock, petitioned Congress. There's a vote held, and this is under the Articles of Confederation, so a little different system. But Franklin misses becoming a state by one vote. One state, I think North Carolina, abstained, and if they would have voted yes, there would be a state of Franklin, theoretically. Cobb also leads the public relations campaign where they write to a who's who of Americans: Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, George Washington, others, Madison. It goes on and on, trying to win their support. Obviously, this diplomatic sort of PR campaign failed, but it's a pretty interesting thing to look back on and see how they're trying to shape public opinion about Franklin. Now, how does Franklin, the Franklin movement, by 1785, it's obvious that there's not going to be any support from North Carolina and very little support from the national government for Franklin. And you begin to see the Franklin government, even really before it even gets started, beginning to face considerable opposition. From North Carolina, there are three governors that have to deal with Franklin. The first is Alexander Martin, the second is Richard Caswell, the third is Samuel Johnston. Alexander Martin was a hardliner. Martin is the governor when Franklin is created, and Martin basically is not having anything to do with it. He sends threatening manifestos. He talks about burning the communities and taking the sword to the Franklinites. And there's probably a better than average chance that if Martin would have been governor for another year or two, there would have been a lot more violence and bloodshed. And Martin has a sort of a zero-sum policy on this. Richard Caswell is an interesting guy. He follows Martin up. Caswell is kind of caught in the middle of this. First, Caswell was a land speculator. He's also friends and business partners with John Sevier. So you have the governor of North Carolina who's tasked with defeating Franklin, who is business partners and friends. There's dozens of letters between these two, and they always sign affectionately or something. You can tell these guys are buddies. So you have the governor of North Carolina tasked with defeating Franklin, and business partner and other kind of relationships with the governor of the rogue state of Franklin, John Sevier. Caswell also owns a lot of land in this area, and the last thing Caswell wants is a full-scale war. Martin wanted war. Caswell settles on something that I call the divide and conquer strategy. And essentially what Caswell wants to do is to tamp down violence and to do things that will undermine Franklin from the inside. He supports the opposition. He also settles on this policy where he creates kind of a dual bureaucracy. So in those Franklin counties, you have a North Carolina government and a Franklin government. You have North Carolina. You have a Washington County, North Carolina court, a Washington County, Franklin court. You have two sheriffs. You have two, and this is in all these counties. Individuals who wanted to get married would get married in the Franklin County court and the North Carolina County court. To be sure, you didn't know where to pay your taxes. The sheriffs of these counties often got into fistfights. By creating that parallel bureaucracy, Caswell wanted to create uncertainty about whether Franklin was legitimate or not. Caswell also supports the leader of the opposition, who Samuel Johnston is also fits more. This last governor, he'll actually have John Sevier, the governor of Franklin, arrested. Johnston is much more in Martin's line, where he doesn't care about violence and bloodshed. He just wants Franklin defeated, John Sevier arrested. That's what he wants, and he gets that. But Caswell and Johnston specifically also support the leader of the opposition force, the anti-Franklinites, often called the Tiptonites, and the man was by the name of John Tipton. If you've ever been to East Tennessee, you'll know there's a historical site just before you're heading up over 26 to go to North Carolina. There's the Tipton Haynes house. You see it on the right. This is where his home was. Tipton was a politically ambitious land speculator, slaveholder, who didn't like John Sevier, and you can't really get into his psyche completely, but he basically is the leader of the opposition force and receives tremendous support from North Carolina. He directs the efforts to defeat Sevier and Franklin from that house I was talking about, the Tipton Haynes house. And Tipton starts off with a small number of supporters or anti-Franklinites, but eventually those numbers grow and keep growing and keep growing. And North Carolina, and Caswell specifically, uses this internal opposition. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but Franklin, when you talk about the state of Franklin existence, it was, East Tennessee was violent before Franklin was created. It gets even more violent afterwards. And it has a lot to do with how the Franklinites conducted their Indian policies. I told you from the beginning, the Franklinites weren't interested in peace treaties. They weren't interested in buying land. They were interested in taking land and killing Indians. That's what they wanted to do. Most of them were elected to political office. Andrew Jackson was elected to political office based on that reputation. Andrew Jackson was admitted to the Tennessee bar in the state, or admitted to the North Carolina bar in the state of Franklin. But anyway, the state of Franklin begins from the very beginning. By 1785, they ratchet up the Indian warfare, attacking Indian villages, the Overhill Cherokee. This is actually from the 1760s, this map, but there's not any from this period. They run right into a burgeoning Cherokee sort of splinter resistance group who moved down onto Chickamauga Creek, down close to Chattanooga. Lookout Mountain is one of their towns. A Cherokee leader by the name of Dragging Canoe, sometimes they call him the Cherokee Dragon. He's a leader of this resistance group. These are the main force that clashes with the Franklinites. So you get the Franklinites who are pushing to attack Indians, pushing to take Indians' land. And you have the Chickamauga Cherokee, led by Dragging Canoe, who are resisting. They're being supported by the British. They're being supported. One of their main supporters happens to be Lord Dunmore, of Dunmore's Wars fame, who becomes the governor of the Bahamas and uses that position to fund a lot of Indian groups. That's another story. But so you have all this violence ratcheting up. And the Franklinites then begin to sort of establish their own kind of Indian diplomacy. And it looks very different than the United States and North Carolina. I think the best example and the most important treaty they ever negotiated with the Cherokee was the Treaty of Dumpling Creek. And don't get the name Dumpling Creek, don't let that convince you this is some kind of homespun meeting between whites and the Franklinites. This was exactly how the Franklinites wanted to conduct their Indian policy. The first thing they do is they bring hundreds of armed men. This is not what happens with the United States and North Carolina. Secondly, alcohol flows freely. Best way to get a good deal. Lastly, they only invite Indian leaders who they know will say yes. The ones that will not are not invited. They meet at Dumpling Creek. They make a massive land purchase. Most of the Cherokee leaders aren't invited, and they disavow Dumpling Creek. This leads Dragging Canoe and the Chickamauga to essentially declare open war over this land cession. You can see his sort of threat there. This flew right in the face of the Treaty of Hopewell that I mentioned before, conducted the same year, where hundreds of Indians and Indian leaders were invited for a month-plus long meeting. Indian concerns were taken into consideration. Alcohol was barred. It was a much more sort of diplomatic and formal process that wasn't done under threat of the bayonet. The Treaty of Hopewell creates a massive crisis in Franklin because with hope, one of the things that the Treaty of Hopewell did was it was the first treaty the United States ever created anything that looked like an Indian reservation. They essentially set aside land for the Cherokee. And some of that land they set aside with Hopewell was in the state of Franklin, including the capital of Franklin. Greenville was actually part of this Hopewell deal. So here you have two discretely different kinds of Indian policies, Indian diplomacy, and you see why Franklin wants their independence, and you see how their vision for how they want to treat the Indians. And I'm not trying to say that the United States or North Carolina was particularly benevolent in how they did this, but it pales in comparison to what the Franklinites did. Now, violence between the Tiptonites and the Franklinites occurred most often during this period at the courthouses. I refer to them in my book as courthouse wars. As you know, they had court days, usually once or twice a month if it was a big town. Everybody came to these court days, and this is rural. This goes all the way to the 20th century. You didn't just come for the court. You could come and sell your wares, or there were parties and collection. It was a gathering of the community, and these gatherings of these. And I mentioned that when North Carolina creates that parallel bureaucracy, you'll have a Franklin court and and a North Carolina court, those courthouses will be the scenes of these clashes. And the Franklin's government papers were kept in these courthouses. And you have these raids on these courthouses. The Tiptonites would rush into the courthouse and beat up everybody in the courthouse, grab all the papers they could, carry them off and set them on fire. That's why there are no Franklin records, because they burned them all, destroyed them all. There are very few Franklin records of the kind of inner workings of the government. These courthouse wars will be the only place that John Sevier and John Tipton, the two sort of antagonists in this story, actually meet. And Tipton, who is considerably older than Sevier, actually beats Sevier over the head with his cane, and he's pulled away, and it doesn't escalate from there. But that sort of defined the clashes between these two partisan groups in Franklin. So you've got Indian violence, you've got internal violence between the Tiptonites and the Franklinites, and this goes on until the winter of 1788, when essentially the final clash and really the end of the Franklin movement occurs. It occurs appropriately on the Tipton Haynes house. This is a picture I took. John Tipton's slave plantation. They don't call it that. That's what it was. What Tipton does, Tipton wants to cause a clash between Sevier. He's got the militia set up, ready to be called into action. He goes in, he confiscates Sevier's slaves because Sevier is not paying taxes to North Carolina. Why would Sevier, the governor of another state, what he considers another state, pay taxes to North Carolina? He confiscates Sevier's slaves. Sevier finds out about it. He brings the Franklin militia to Tipton's house. They surround the house. Over a 2-day period, after Tipton gets some reinforcements, they clash. 4 or 5 people are killed. 6 or 7 more are wounded. So the Franklinites are defeated. Sevier is forced to retreat. And Sevier essentially escapes down into the southern counties of Franklin to lick his wounds and to plot his return. So Sevier's defeat at the battle of what I call the Battle of Franklin is the kind of beginning of the end. After his defeat, Samuel Johnston finally issues an arrest warrant for Sevier. Sevier is actually not arrested for what he does at Franklin. He's arrested because he was in charge of a small militia company that brutally, and I mean brutally, murdered 2 Cherokee chiefs who had been working since the American Revolution to create peace between whites and Indians, Old Tassel and Old Abraham. And the murder is particularly brutal, and he's arrested for it. He claims that he didn't have anything to do with it, but the men were under his command. John Tipton, who you can imagine is probably the greatest day of his life, is given the arrest warrant for Sevier, rounds up a small posse. They hunt Sevier down, they find him, and they arrest him. There's a lot of legend and mythology surrounding the state of Franklin. One of the legends is that Sevier, he's taken to Morganton, North Carolina, taken over the mountain. That's where the jail was, the bigger jail. They considered Sevier a major flight risk. And the story goes that Sevier gets to the Morganton jail, and some of his supporters from East Tennessee travel across the mountain secretly and bust him out in the middle of the night. The truth is, he's delivered to the jailer in Morganton's in Burke County, the Burke County jailer, who happened to be under Sevier's command at the Battle of Kings Mountain. They're good friends. Sevier shows up, they take the handcuffs off, he immediately goes to a tavern, they're drinking whiskey or whatever, and his supporters come from East Tennessee, and they ride off. There's no escape, there's no effort to apprehend him. Even before Sevier's arrest, North Carolina begins to try to peel off support for Franklin, issuing pardons for anybody that they're willing to forgive back taxes. Remember, the Franklinites weren't paying their North Carolina state taxes. North Carolina says, you don't have to pay those. They offer them political and military positions. And you begin to see, towards the end of 1787, people sort of leaving. David Campbell, the judge, leaves, goes back to North Carolina. People are pledging their loyalty back to North Carolina. The only person they don't offer a pardon to is John Sevier, but eventually they even pardon John Sevier. He quickly comes back, becomes a senator from North Carolina, actually attends the Constitutional Convention, then he's made He's made the assistant territorial governor of the Southwest Territory and eventually becomes the first governor of Tennessee, though he didn't suffer particularly from this process. So I guess you're sitting there now saying, this guy's just for 45 minutes told me the story of Franklin. What the heck does this have to do with West Virginia? All right, well, let me make that quick connection. It all has to do with the fact that when Franklin was occurring, the United States Constitution was in the process of being drafted, and especially towards the end. And the Franklin movement, which received a lot of publicity, was something that the political leadership of the United States, at this time under the Articles of Confederation, didn't like. Not only did you have, the Franklin event, but you had Vermont pushing for statehood. You had the Revolutionary period violence in New Hampshire with Ethan Allen and his group agitating against New York. You had a lot of individuals who were pushing to create states out of pre-existing states. All right, that's the West Virginia story, right? To create a state out of a pre-existing state. So when the sort of framers of the Constitution are coming together and they're trying to figure out, what's this new frame of government going to look like? They want to provide an orderly, codified process on how a state is created out of a pre-existing state. This is what happened with Franklin. Franklin created out of North Carolina, violent, chaotic. They don't want that again. So what they did, and you remember from your history classes, the Articles of Confederation drafted during the Revolution designed specifically to prevent any kind of monarchical tentacles of seeping into the United States government, was designed to severely restrict the national government, severe restrictions on what could be done and what couldn't be done. There's nothing in the Articles of Confederation about state making, territorial acquisitions, nothing in there about that, or at least nothing concrete in there. So as they're scrapping the Articles of Confederation, then they decide this is the time to codify the state-making process. And what they do is they insert Article 4, Section 3, something that I think every West Virginian should know, because it is at the core of why we are a state. And in that Article 3, it says, no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other state, nor any state be formed by the junction of two or more states or parts of states. And this is the part that's important, without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned as well as of Congress. Essentially, Franklin can't become a state unless North Carolina and the United States Congress says it's okay. All right? Now, so Article 4, Section 3 is a direct response, if we'll be honest, to Franklin, Vermont. Vermont's having the same thing. So while this constitutional provision has no effect on Franklin, because the Constitution was ratified in 1789, you don't really see this being challenged until later. It would play a critical role in West Virginia's creation nearly 80 years later. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about West Virginia's statehood, but I do want to talk a little bit specifically about how Article 4, Section 3, again, that is born out of the Franklin, Vermont statehood separatist movements, how this plays out and how the sort of founders of West Virginia, as well as the Lincoln administration, deals with it. So, of course, all this begins with when Virginia secedes from the Union, and you have some strong opposition, specifically in northwestern Virginia, Clarksburg, Morgantown, Wheeling. You guys, I'm sure, know this story well. April 1861, Virginia leaves the Union. Eventually, eventually the voters of Virginia are presented with this ordinance of secession. Here's the vote from Kanawha. I got this from y'all's website. I love this. I show my students. Here's the vote in Kanawha County. But on May 23rd, the citizens of Virginia overwhelmingly vote for secession. Of course, we know that many Western votes were either cast out, thrown away, discarded, or voters were intimidated. You risked your life to vote against secession anywhere in Virginia in reality, maybe outside of Wheeling. And this triggered the Second Wheeling Convention, the first session of the Second Wheeling Convention. It meets in June of 1861. And at the first session of the Second Wheeling Convention, they settle on a strategy. They don't go all out and say, we're going to create a state. Because the political leadership knew that there's a constitutional blueprint to do this. And the first thing they realized is they've got to get Virginia to agree to allow West Virginia to come into existence. The question is, what is Virginia? Obviously, Confederate Virginia is not. There's nobody in Richmond going to agree to allow a third of the state to break off. So what they come up with is a plan to what they call reorganize or restore the Virginia government. It's based on this principle that any political leader who voted for Virginia to secede from the Union has essentially abandoned their position in the Union. They're no longer a state politician. So they have to go in and they have to elect new state politicians. So that's what they do. They reorganize it, and they elect Frank Pierpont governor. They elect, all the state, so essentially what you end up with in 1861 is a Confederate Virginia state government in Richmond with basically all the military, all the money, all the power. And then you have a Union state government in Wheeling, headed by Frank Pierpont. Now this wasn't done for Virginia's sake. Well, maybe a little bit. But one of the primary reason it's done, and I don't have any evidence of this, but I feel quite confident that there's a lot of puppeteering coming out of Washington and the Lincoln administration. They're setting this up so Frank Pierpont can, what? Agree to allow Virginia to allow West Virginia to become a state. That is what happens. This is part of that Article 4, Section 3 requirement, and this would allow the Pierpont government, the Virginia government, to allow West Virginia to come into existence per Article 4, Section 3. Of course, the delegates come back to Wheeling just a few weeks later for the second session of the Second Wheeling Convention. They meet in August. Here is where West Virginia is really born. Here's where, towards the end of the convention, a new state ordinance is proposed, at the time calling itself Canal. And eventually the new state legislation is presented to the voters of West Virginia in October. They mostly support the state, again, kind of and very much reminiscent of the vote on secession. A lot of votes against the state are discarded. There are whole counties, I've been told, where the votes were discarded, the strongly pro-Confederate counties in the South. But eventually, by 1862, the West Virginia statehood proposal had been basically crafted in Wheeling, voted on, supported by the citizens of I think there were 39 counties at the time who were going to be part of this West Virginia, this new state of West Virginia. They had settled on a name, West Virginia. They had settled on borders. That's another whole story. They were very controversial. And they had a constitution that kicked the can on slavery, but they'd deal with that later. So all that was left was congressional approval. And on May 29, 1862, Virginia's reorganized government, Senator Wakeman T. Willey, presented a formal petition to the United States Senate to admit West Virginia into the Union. The primary sticking point in the Senate and later the House will be slavery, but I'm not going to go into that story after that. Into that, once they address that with the Willey Amendment, the Senate passes the West Virginia Statehood legislation 2317. The House passes it on December 11th, 9655, and all that was left was Abraham Lincoln's signature. I always remind my students, Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer. Of course, he was a lawyer admitted to the bar in Kentucky, and Lincoln's cabinet, they were all lawyers. And when Lincoln, but he did, and you end up with, I think, one of the most impressive cabinets, definitely in the 19th century, but probably in the history of the country. And Lincoln is very concerned about two things. And this is a letter I got from the Library of Congress, pen in his own hand. He says, the two questions, you can see them down at the bottom. He's got the West Virginia Statehood Bill in front of him. He says, first, is the act constitutional? Secondly, is it expedient? Well, the expediency issue is quite easy to understand. Lincoln wants to know, if I sign this piece of legislation and West Virginia becomes a 35th state in the Union, will it help me with the war effort? Will it end the war? Will it attract support? Will it peel off other states? Maybe it'll influence Kentucky or Missouri or Maryland or whatever. How will this affect the war? And, well, he has thoughts on that. The constitutionality issue revolves basically around one issue, and that is the Pierpont reorganized government really the government of Virginia? And if it is, then it can give consent per Article 4, Section 3. And if it is not, it cannot give consent. Therefore, West Virginia's creation will be unconstitutional. He presents this, again, to those legal minds, to his Secretary of State, William Seward, Salmon Chase, Edwin Stanton. They are he has 6 cabinet members, he asked. 3 of them, these 3, say yes. This is from Seward's opinion. They write legal opinions. You can read these all at the Library of Congress. Quote, I am therefore of the opinion that the act of the admission of West Virginia is a constitutional one. But of course there's opposition. Lincoln asked for some clarification. He gets 3 yeses, 3 noes. The noes are led by Edward Bates, the Attorney General, Gideon Wells, the Secretary of Navy, Montgomery Blair, Postmaster General. And they make a different argument. Their argument is the West Virginia bill is not warranted by the Constitution. Quote, the government of Virginia does not and never did in fact represent and govern more than a small fraction of the state. He's talking about Pierpont. Perhaps a 4th part. And the legislature, which pretends to give the consent of Virginia to her own dismemberment, is composed chiefly of men who represent those counties who constitute the new state of West Virginia. Not to have anything thrown at me, but that's true. That's true. Lincoln's attempt to clarify this issue by appealing to his cabinet backfires. And he ends up with 40 pages of legal opinions all over the map, and his cabinet splits. Lincoln, of course, waits 2 more days. He received these opinions on the 29th. And on December 31st, 1862, Lincoln makes his decision. You know what that is. And he addresses these concerns about the Pierpont government in his legal opinion. It says, Lincoln stated that it's not the qualified voters, but the qualified voters who chose to vote that constitutes the political power of the state. As to the validity of the Pierpont government, Lincoln asserts, quote, we cannot deny that the body which consents to the admission of West Virginia is the legislature of Virginia. That's his opinion. That's his legal opinion on it. And then as far as the expediency, it's where you get the famous quote, I'm sure it's carved around here somewhere, about West Virginia, where he says about the war, quote, we can scarcely dispense with the aid of West Virginia in this struggle, much less can we afford to have her against us in Congress and in the field. So he comes down. So, of course, on April 20th, 1863, Lincoln issues his statehood proclamation. In 60 days, West Virginia will become the 35th state in the Union, and of course that gives us June 20th, West Virginia Day, when on June 20th, 1863, the first governor, Arthur Borman, officially declared West Virginia the 35th state. So, just to quickly wrap this up, you can see that, and if you go into details in the legislative debates as well as the debates in Congress about the West Virginia statehood bill, you can see that Article 4, Section 3 is at the center of not only Lincoln's decision, but also at the center of how people like Frank Pierpont and Wakeman T. Willey and Arthur Borman and the sort of founding fathers of West Virginia constructed the state, and how they were fitting that process into the constitutional requirements. And that constitutional requirement was at least largely driven by the experiences of the people that were drafting the Constitution and the people at the Constitution, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention who were debating the Constitution, influenced by the experiences with the state of Franklin and that chaos and that violence and that uncertainty that it created, and the fact that the Constitution provided no real direct guidance. In the end, it would be a rather short and overlooked article in the United States Constitution, inspired by the disastrous state of Franklin, that would help to shape the process of West Virginia's creation. That's it. Thank you. I guess I'll take questions if I
Constitution that you have to look at, and that is that the Congress can set its own qualifications for its members.
Right.
But I never see any documentation or any discussion of the whole politics that must have gone on in Washington to see that Congress.
Yeah, and I'm aware of that. And I know, I mean, the best place to see legal arguments about this actually happens between 1865 and 68 when Virginia sues West Virginia to restore Jefferson and Berkeley counties back. And the argument they make is that the Pierpont government, and they use the term legal fiction, which you know.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's within those debates that you see some other kind of arguments that are coming. You know, it's difficult. You know, there's lots of correspondence between Pierpont and Lincoln and people in Lincoln's administration, but there's not the correspondence isn't. I haven't found the correspondence rich enough to really see the inner workings of these two men and to really see. Because I'd love to see some evidence, some direct evidence. It's just my theory that the Lincoln administration is pulling the strings on this, and basically. There are people involved in D.C. in Wheeling, and they're back and forth, and they're figuring out how to craft this process and this legislation. Because the language on slavery in the original West Virginia Constitution really says nothing. I mean, it doesn't deal with emancipation. It doesn't deal with gradual emancipation. It doesn't deal with any of the kind of issues. It was just to sort of kick the can. It was almost sort of like the Lincoln administration saying, put us something together that meets these basic requirements. We'll send it to Congress, and Congress can sort it out. And I think that's kind of what you're saying. There's another level to this, and there's probably, you know, obviously there's a lot of discussion and debates that didn't make it into the historical record, or at least didn't survive. Maybe didn't survive the, you know, whatever. But I don't, you know, I think you bring up a good point.
Well, there's another layer too, and that is Lincoln bought himself a railroad.
Sure. Sure. There's all kinds of those sorts of things. I tried to keep it narrowly focused on this, you know, I went a little over an hour now, so I don't know how much more you guys can stand.
Did this happen in other states?
The
formation of Franklin. Does it happen in Maine or Georgia?
Not in I think the closest example is what happens in Kentucky. And of course, Kentucky statehood goes back to 1787, 1788, very much at the end of Franklin, and it's eerily similar to how this plays out. The rejection, the sort of chaos involved in Kentucky, the rejection by the United States Congress of it. It takes I think 13 or 14 different conventions before you actually have a Kentucky statehood bill, and it finally gets to. Kentucky finally becomes a state in 1792, but you have a lot of similarities in Kentucky as well, and you have the constitutional requirement already in place at the time. I hesitate to draw these sort of comparisons. I mean, you have similar kind of things that happen in Vermont, and I'm trying to think if there's some other examples that fit. But I think Franklin is unique, and I think the way Kentucky, there's similarities with what happens with Kentucky, but I think they're all very specific to the circumstances that they're occurring in. A lot of this is personality driven. The people that were in leadership positions often determine how these things played out. I think Kentucky had much more skilled leadership, and Virginia was more receptive to Kentucky becoming a state, especially towards when you start getting into the early, 1789, 90, 91. Then they begin. Virginia basically lets Kentucky go, and there's some opposition, but it's nothing like North Carolina wasn't going to let Franklin go.
There were no issues like we had with Virginia when Kentucky broke off. There's no question about, U.S. money.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
They did. Kentucky had to pay, did they?
I'm not familiar with the intimate details of this, but there are a lot of Virginians that lose land in Kentucky or have businesses in Kentucky, and you have some of those issues. I mean, it's nothing like postbellum Virginia and the lawsuits that swarm across West Virginia over taxes and land and Virginia had it out for West Virginia. Not so much in Kentucky. One of the things that happens in Kentucky is so many of the leaders of Kentucky had families still back in Virginia. Lots of them. I mean, so you have, if you look at the sort of who's who of early Kentucky history, I mean, a lot of the early founders of Tennessee and Kentucky came from one particular county, Pittsylvania County in Virginia, which is where Danville and Lynchburg are now. I don't know why. Pennsylvania County is much bigger than, but you see a lot of people. So you have this one area on the Dan River that produces a lot of these families, or at least sometimes it's a second step. You know, move from Williamsburg or somewhere on the East Coast, and then second step, and then they move into the frontier. So I don't know if the family connections tamp down some of the litigation and tensions that may have emerged between Kentucky and Virginia. Franklin never gets far enough for any of that kind of stuff to play out. 3 years, and you don't really. The tax issue goes away. I think North Carolina basically does not force the leaders of Franklin to pay back taxes. They're just happy to have it over. And then North Carolina, of course, almost immediately gives what Franklin and more to the federal government, and they create a territory. This is part of the Constitution. You get the Southwest. You've heard of the Northwest Territory and provision, the ordinance of the Northwest Territory. Well, there's also an ordinance of Southwest Territory, and they create a territory of the Southwest Territory in 1790, and in 1796 that becomes Tennessee. So it's a kind of it's a different dynamic.
Who was the governor of North Carolina when the national government voted, failed to vote in favor of the state of Franklin?
I think it was Caswell. I think the vote was taken in 1786, so I think it was Caswell.
Because I was wondering why they would abstain, but he was one who was sort of trying to have both ways.
The congressional record is painfully silent on that. I don't know why. All that's there is the vote, the yeas and nays. It was like, I don't know what the vote was, but it was one off. It required a 3/4 majority in the Articles, under the Articles of Confederation to allow this to happen, and they missed it by a single vote. So. Yes, sir.
Not to get too far off the subject, but what you were talking about, those Cherokee Indians, you said, basically there's 3 different groups of them. You called something about over the hill or over hill, or what do you mean by that? You mean they were on the other side of the Appalachians?
Yeah, that's basically it.
Is that what the, okay.
So if you think of the Cherokee, if you think of the Cherokee Nation at 3 sections, and the main section, the largest population, and this changes all the time, but the period I'm talking about, down in South Carolina, and up just into North Carolina, they call those the lower towns. That's just what whites call them. The middle towns were the section in western North Carolina over to Acona, where Cherokee is now, or Acona-Lufty, all the way up to the I mean, this is imprecise, but basically to the Continental Divide, top of the Appalachian, top of the Blue Ridge. And then when you started coming down the other side, those were the Cherokee over the hill. And that's what they call them, the Overhill Cherokee.
Well, they would have been sort of like in the Indian hunting grounds there of Kentucky then, wouldn't they?
They claimed it. The Cherokee claimed it, the Shawnee claimed it. Well, the Cherokee and the Shawnee were bitter enemies, going back even before contact.
That's interesting.
Really, the most interesting group of the Overhill Cherokee are the Chickamauga Cherokee, the sort of splinter group. And they're really remarkable, the kind of stuff that they do.
Where were they?
They were in outside of Chattanooga. They had
sort of over the hill group.
Yeah, they were south of the Overhill, so they were sort of lower Tennessee Valley. They had 5 towns: Nickajack, Running Water, Lookout Mountain. I forget the other 2, but they were really remarkable. It's probably 500, 700 of them at the most, heavily supplied by the British and the Spanish. They used the Spanish used British. They were really Scottish trade firms to secretly funnel money to them. and money and weapons to them. And in exchange, they basically, the Spanish and the British fought the American Westerners with surrogate Indian warriors that they funded. The British funded them from the Bahamas. The story of Dunmore, what Dunmore does after the American Revolution, is remarkable. Dunmore was he's an interesting figure. Anything else? Good questions. I wish I had all the answers. Hey, how many of you guys have heard of the state of Franklin before?
Never had.
Oh, cool. How many of you have been unfortunate enough to see me on TV talking about it? I learned about the state of Franklin when I was an undergraduate. I'm a South Carolinian. I went down to a little school down there named Winthrop, and I'd heard about the Battle of Kings Mountain, and I heard about the state of Franklin. And I went to graduate school in Cullowhee, North Carolina, Western Carolina. And I knew about it and read a little bit about it, but I went all the way to West Virginia to decide to write a book on it. This little lasted 3.5 years. That's the largest number of people I've ever heard. I've ever seen raise their hand when I asked if they've ever heard of it. But I have, got me a job. I've been on two different documentaries. My first book, the state of Franklin. I'll talk about it. Anybody wants to talk, I'll come to your home and talk about it. I know the state of Franklin a lot.
Thank you.
The idea of Vandalia, with the progress that was done to produce Franklin.
I mean, that's
how far did the people get with that proposal?
With Vandalia?
Yeah.
I mean, the Vandalia is another kind of murky area, but they had a company, they had a board of directors, they had investors, they had surveys, they had plans, they had a colony. It would have been the Vandalia colony. They were set. And no American Revolution, it's kind of counterfactual history. You may have had a colony of Vandalia. There was opposition to it, but mostly Vandalia is mostly land speculators opposing other land speculators.
If my memory is correct, was there not some involvement or support by Franklin?
Yeah, he was a member of the Vandalia Company, absolutely. He was, and there's not a lot, I mean, I haven't done a lot of research on Vandalia. It is there's a couple of good articles, and I've got a collection of Vandalia documents from Robert Walpole. He's probably the main guy in it. I don't know exactly what Ben Franklin's role was in Vandalia. He was on the board of directors. Obviously, I mean, Franklin was an entrepreneur, to say the least, and I'm sure he was involved, in financing it or investing money in it. But I don't know about, I've never seen a lot of letters from Ben Franklin talking about the inner workings of Vandalia. I've never actually seen a letter from Ben Franklin even mentioning Vandalia, but I've seen lists of Vandalia investors, and he's certainly in there.
There was never any attempt to move beyond that thing they had to do. Was the proposal presented to London?
Yes, absolutely. And the only way I know this is because there's a collection of those letters, of Vandalia letters, at the Virginia Historical Society. Sorry for mentioning them again, but that have a royal seal on them, to where they've seen them and they've come back and they've seen what they are. But you pretty much tapped out my knowledge of Vandalia. That's a story that's waiting to really, really, really be dug into. There's a who's who of Pennsylvanians and Virginians that are on that list of investors. This transition from the Walpole Company to the Vandalia Company to the what was the third name?
I believe it was West Bain.
Yes, that's it. Yeah, some other. I really don't know that story, and there's an article or two, but there's nobody's ever written a full book, a full monograph.
Well, that's your next thing, and then you have one job and 4 documentaries.
I like the fact they named it Vandalia.
Yeah.
The Queen of the Vandals. What a great story. No, I don't know. I mean, it's something I read said everything says that the American Revolution basically interrupted that. By the time the war is over, there's obviously no need for a colony, and I don't know how many of those investors were loyalists, how many of them were not. you know, who was really putting up the money, because, you know, Ben Franklin was, you know, wealthy, but he wasn't, you know, Vandalia money wealthy. So he was probably a minor investor in it. I don't know the story. I mean, I've thought about it, and I'm interested in it.
Interesting that it could have been loyalists who left.
No, you're right. No, that's right. I'm sure it was. I mean, the Walpoles were. I mean, they're a prominent loyalist family, and yeah, I just don't know the answer to that. That's a good question. One of my favorite things about coming to West Virginia and studying West Virginia history is how much of our state's got, it's a fascinating history. There's no question about it, but the best part about it for somebody like me is how much of it hasn't been looked into. There's so much of it. I mean, I mean, when I'm dealing with students who are looking for research projects, I mean, they're everywhere. There's just so much out there to look into that hasn't been written about, or hadn't been written about in 75 years, or hasn't been explored in, you know, in depth, and that's a wonderful thing. I think it's probably a great thing for this archives as well. But yeah, I've suggested, I've actually handed my Vandalia document scans to students and tried to encourage them to write papers on them. But students are not interested in the 18th century. They're not really interested in the 19th century much anymore. Civil War, mostly modern students are interested in post-1940. A lot of interest in that. Stuff like, obviously, World War II, and then moving on into specifically the 60s and then the 70s. They're interested in it. And in West Virginia in particular, students are interested in coal, mine wars. I don't get a lot of students who are interested in Indians and frontier and that kind of thing. I don't know, revolution. I try. I give a lot of lectures and talks.
For them, that's really old history.
I know, it's old history for all of us. I really appreciate you guys coming out and being such a fantastic audience. Good questions. Thank you guys.